Hello, everyone. It's a little bit after 1 o'clock, and I know we all have busy schedules ahead of us, even though it is absolutely gorgeous outside. Sorry for that reminder. Welcome. My name is Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs for Capital District Regional Planning Commission, and today's webinar is Building a Walkable and Accessible Capital Region for All. This session is being presented by Jennifer Saponis and Carrie Ward from the Capital District Transportation Committee. If you've joined us before, you know, or if you've flown before, you know that the announcements are coming as far as how to exit the airplane. I've got to do my announcements as well. So if you joined before, bear with me. If this is your first time joining us, I appreciate your joining us. And here's a little housekeeping. For those of you that do not know us, CDRPC is a regional planning and resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties. And we foster intergovernmental cooperation, communicating, collaborating, and facilitating regional initiatives. We work with partners to help them address regional problems. This webinar series was established to help planners sharpen their skills and to provide a vehicle for Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals members to obtain necessary credit hours. Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals members are required by state statute to have 4 hours of training per year. And municipalities have a wide latitude in defining what training is acceptable for credit. After each webinar in the series, each attendee that registered with an email address will receive an email confirming your attendance, and that email may be submitted to your municipality for consideration of credit. For those of you that are calling in, contact CDRPC and we can confirm your attendance and work with you to furnish a certificate in lieu of the automatic email that the rest of those folks receive. For practicing AICP planners, we've submitted this question for 1 hour of CM to the APA. Our attendees join with video and audio off for security purposes. As we have a large audience and we hope to engage in a spirited dialogue, I can unmute attendees to ask them questions directly. To give me a heads up you'd like to ask a question in person, just let me know in the chat box or use the Q&A function. I'll then unmute you so you have the opportunity to speak with our presenters and ask your questions. Alternatively, you can just type your question into the chat box and I'll try to pick my spot to jump in and ask, much like a radio DJ would do with a guest. We will be archiving the presentation material as a PDF, so the presentation we're seeing today will be archived. That will be available on the Eventbrite website. It's the same site you use to register for the series and pick the webinars you want to attend. We are recording the session, and recordings of sessions will be posted on the CDRPC YouTube channel at the conclusion of the webinar series. And I'm hearing from the captain it's time to take off, so we can start beginning to get on the runway here. Today's session is Building a Walkable and Accessible Community for All. In this session, we'll detail the Capital District Transportation Committee's long-range plan, New Visions 2050, the recommendations for building more walkable communities, and why this is important for creating more equitable, healthy, accessible, and quality regions will also be discussed. This overview will identify specific strategies identified in New Visions 2050 and how CDTC is working with local governments to implement them. So with that, I will turn it over to Jen and Carrie to take over. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Martin. So I'm going to share my screen. Martin, if you can stop sharing your screen there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you see the presentation?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, again, thank you, Martin, and thank you to the Capital District Regional Planning Commission for inviting CDTC to participate in today's webinar. I am Jen Saponis, and me and my colleague Carrie Ward are going to talk about how the Capital District Transportation Committee is working with communities to build a walkable and accessible capital region for all. So if you are working as a planner in the capital region, I apologize for all the next just couple of slides. I'll try to get through them quickly. But if you're not familiar with the Capital District Transportation Committee, we were established in 1964. We are a metropolitan planning organization, and these are organizations that are required by federal transportation legislation for metropolitan areas with populations over 50,000. Our region consists of 2 urban areas that include 77 municipalities. Also included in CDTC is the Department of Transportation, CDTA, the Thruway, the Port, the Airport, and our friends here from CDRPC. And if you're not familiar with metropolitan planning organizations or MPOs, like I said, they are required by federal transportation legislation. The Federal Highway Act of 1962 established MPOs. We are a forum for cooperative multimodal transportation decision-making. We program federal transportation funding for local transportation projects. And we are responsible for developing 3 major products, and these include the Long Range Plan or Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and this is what CDTC refers to as New Visions. It establishes investment policies and principles that guide decision-making and activities for a planning horizon of 20 years or more, and it's updated every 5 years. We also are responsible for developing the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, which is a 5-year capital program, and then the Unified Planning Work Program, which is a 2-year plan that includes all of the MPO's activities and tasks and budget. So the centerpiece of our New Visions plan are the planning and investment principles. And these principles are directly related to criteria that we use to evaluate proposed projects and to prioritize projects for federal funding. They were developed and proposed over time by our members, by our New Visions task forces, by stakeholders, and with public support. And again, they influence the types of tasks and initiatives CDTC initiates and supports, like our local road safety plan, the Capital District's trails plan, security planning. And one of those principles is to encourage bicycle and pedestrian travel. So this is specific to what we'll be talking about today, but as you can see, many of these principles support creating a walkable and accessible capital region. So the principle, the full principle is that CDTC recognizes walking and bicycling as socially, economically, and environmentally responsible and a healthy approach to improving the performance of our transportation system. Bicycle and pedestrian improvements will be considered from the perspective of developing a system and not just based on whether a particular facility is currently used. A regional system of sidewalks, bicycle facilities, and multi-use trails will encourage safe bicycle and pedestrian use. So CDTC has worked with many communities throughout many of the 77 different municipalities throughout the capital region to develop plans, transportation and land use plans, and some of these, in fact, focus on just walking or bicycling, or walking and bicycling. They're often kind of lumped in together, or are definitely related to creating more walkable, livable streets and spaces. And a common transportation planning adage is that every trip is a pedestrian trip, including trips by car, which begin and end on foot. Whether you're in a parking lot, in a crosswalk, or on a road, everyone's a pedestrian. And as a result, pedestrian planning and the consideration of pedestrian needs are integral elements of nearly all of CDTC's planning activities. CDTC's role is to encourage context-sensitive pedestrian accommodations throughout the region as part of a complete streets policy framework. CDTC refers to complete streets as those that accommodate all users, pedestrians, bicyclists, transit, cars, and allow us to maximize regional transportation choices and mobility. So I'll discuss how CDTC supports local pedestrian efforts in the following slides. So some of the obstacles to walkability that we have to overcome, of course, are the design of roadways. The width and alignment influences how drivers behave. If roadways are designed with speed as the top priority and pedestrians are an afterthought, they may not work well for pedestrians. We often see pedestrian facilities that don't make sense to the user, and that encourages bad behaviors like crossing outside the crosswalk or against a signal. Also, poor or just a lack of land use planning can create conditions that make it difficult for people to walk. Communities where development may be more spread out and land uses are separated, neighborhoods are separated from commercial land uses or other destinations like schools and civic institutions. This may reduce connections and create isolated pods and make people feel like their only option is to drive. And you can feel the difference when you are walking. If you're walking down a sidewalk on a 45-mile-per-hour roadway next to parking lots, compared to walking down the sidewalk in a neighborhood where maybe streets, houses and buildings are closer to the street, or roads are narrower and vehicles travel slower. It feels different. And this is where zoning and design guidelines can help create conditions that encourage walking. And then safety includes everything from traffic safety to crime. If a person doesn't feel safe, they are less likely to choose walking for a trip. And, CDTC receives requests from communities that have complete streets policies, and they've been really good at adopting these and working at developing plans. But some communities still struggle on the coordination between within local governments or between different levels of government to implement complete streets projects. So these are goals related to transportation infrastructure that support walkability, and these are goals that shape policy and decision-making in the metropolitan planning process. Conformity, or ensuring pedestrian infrastructure conforms to existing standards, rules, and laws like ADA compliance, expanding access to walking and bicycling infrastructure to all communities, developing walkable centers that support people of all ages and all abilities, building a transportation system that has the ability to move people despite obstacles or the inability to access a private vehicle, creating a connected walking and bicycling network by filling identified network gaps, focusing on closing gaps and expanding pedestrian infrastructure to those in the region where the greatest need to walk or bike and take transit is, prioritizing investments in walking and transit as a means of expanding economic opportunity like access to jobs, childcare, and medical services, and building a regional transportation network that links places where people live and work and can be navigable with comfort and dignity, again, by all users and all abilities, and get people where they need to go safely and efficiently by prioritizing safety. And federal transportation funds should be invested in a system that enhances the economic and social well-being of Capital District residents while promoting quality of life and positive effects on the surrounding community. So what does the Capital District look like right now? The region is unique in that we have multiple, we're a multi-nodal region. We have 8 cities and a number of towns and villages. We're connected by a series of bridges and highways and arterials, but we're also connected by an identity, an economy, and a culture. So despite our, very stable economy, being the home of the state capital, as well as pretty significant education and medical institutions, we have not seen significant population growth, and projections don't show any significant increases in the future. And despite this lack of population growth, we have seen continued development, which has increased our auto dependence and need for private vehicles to access place to place throughout the region. So supporting and expanding walkability can help address a number of priorities. Definitely reducing greenhouse gas emissions from driving, serving the changing needs of the region's population. We have an aging population. There are changing lifestyle preferences, a changing economy, and technological changes that have shifted vehicle trips to shared mobility or ride hail and transit. and provide mobility freedom to people who cannot drive or choose not to own a vehicle. And expanding walkability can reduce demand for driving and parking, which can help extend the life of our existing transportation network, which is very costly to maintain. So why should we build a walkable capital region? Of course, we are focused on people and the people who want to walk or need to walk, but also, building a capital region benefits everyone. It reduces congestion, it improves traffic safety. There are health benefits. We've heard from people over the last year that during, the pandemic, walking has really helped them emotionally, mentally, and physically. So just being able to get outside and in their community has been a benefit. There's also air quality benefits, increases access to transit, can create economic development, create space and comfort for mobility assistance device users, and reduces parking demand. But also, not everyone can or chooses to drive or own a vehicle. As much as we often rely on personal vehicles for mobility, the system is vulnerable because of its reliance on resources that are volatile and susceptible to disruptions. We saw last week, we knew that the transportation system could be vulnerable to the economy and weather events, wars and politics, but also hacking. So that is another reason to continue to invest and build a walkable region. Owning a vehicle is expensive at about $9,000 a year. That's only 14% of income for the median income household in the region, but it's more than twice that for a low income household. And we know that driving is a major contributor to the climate crisis, and relying on vehicles steals the freedom to be independent and to move around communities from young people who are not yet able to drive, from people with a variety of cognitive or physical disabilities, from aging adults, and from any one of us who could experience a long-term or temporary disability or economic hardship that impacts our ability to access and drive a vehicle. So having the choice to safely walk to school, to work, to medical services, or to transit to access these things is a key to a sustainable, equitable, and resilient region. So it's good to build a walkable region for a lot of reasons, but especially there is a lot of public support in the region for investing in pedestrian infrastructure and accessibility and safe walking spaces. When we did our New Visions public participation last summer, we did virtual public meetings, surveys, and we had a funding poll that asked people if they had a hypothetical $100, how would they spend it on transportation projects? And we saw 20% say the bike and ped facilities were that 20% of our funding should go to bike and ped facilities and 21% should go to public transit. So as you can see, people are not, maintaining our roads, our bridges are definitely very important, but people also want to see walking expanded and improved. When we asked people what does a quality region mean to them, as you can see, walkability, access, it came up very often. So we definitely know that there is a lot of support in the region to continue pedestrian planning and investments in walkability and complete streets. So the demand is there also according to the data we've collected. The data we've collected doing pedestrian counts around the region every few years shows that more people are walking. Also on our trail counts that we've conducted, we've also seen that there are more users per mile. And of course, this is split with bicyclists, but still there are more people using our trails for walking. In the last year, we've been monitoring mobility impacts from COVID and from the New York State on pause policy. And we did some spot checks on trails last summer. We saw the Zim Smith Trail trail usage increase significantly, whereas the Albany Shaker Trail, which is near British American Boulevard in Colony and really surrounded by offices, saw a big decline in walking because nobody was in their offices. And then the Apple mobility trends data, which this is just people who have iPhones who are looking for map directions on Apple Maps, but it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into data since we don't have comprehensive pedestrian data to show that walking has increased in the last year through the pandemic. And of course, I don't want to frame COVID as an opportunity, but COVID provided local officials and planners with an opportunity to experiment with how streets are used and for whom. And there were a lot of successful reuse cases that communities were enthusiastic about. The chart on the left, this is data that CDTC had access to from Streetlight, and this is probe data from cell phones. We only had access to it through July, but it showed a significant reduction in traffic throughout the region. And we don't have this exact data anymore, but other data shows that traffic has begun to rebound, but it looks a little bit different. Some areas are seeing congestion midday instead of an AM and PM peak, and some areas are seeing steady continuous traffic from increase in delivery drivers and other new services. So if we don't have to plan around an AM and PM peak hour, does this change how we use our streets in the long term? Can we reallocate space? You know, how will this affect us in the long term? We don't know, but that's something that we are watching. And we did see some communities last summer take advantage of by using the streets to allow for outdoor dining or recreation, or just to provide extra space for people to walk or bike or exercise. And, you know, open streets wasn't good for everyone necessarily. Some communities really struggled in the beginning to get it right. And of course, you know, we were in the middle of a crisis and we want to give people a lot of grace and room to adapt and shift. But as we give up, you know, some of these public spaces to private uses, we need to make sure that everyone can still navigate sidewalks and streets safely. So people pushing strollers or using mobility assistance devices, we definitely saw some communities really adapt and shift and be able to continue to provide access to everyone. So how are we actually building a walkable region? CDTC has developed a criteria for evaluating transportation projects that prioritize multimodal facilities. Something unique that CDTC does that demonstrates our support for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure is the network set aside. And these are a portion of federal funds that are set aside solely for bicycle and pedestrian projects. Projects whose main objective is to support walking and bicycling. These have funded a lot of sidewalk and trail projects, and we've seen it increase significantly since its introduction in the early 2000s, and has played a really meaningful role in increasing the number of miles of sidewalks and trails and safe crossings in the region. CDTC also provides technical assistance to local governments. We provide training opportunities, complete streets workshops. We've also had the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, trainings here in the Capital Region. We've established a Complete Streets Advisory Committee that works with the State Department of Transportation to identify opportunities to improve walking and biking when repaving and other transportation projects come up. We do a lot of public outreach, safety education, and other outreach on how to use new devices, traffic devices that are introduced, and of course data collection. We collect data on existing infrastructure like sidewalks, bicycle infrastructure, trails. We evaluate pavement conditions. We conduct counts and surveys. And this is all data and information that we provide to local governments by request. And as you can see, we've only started inventorying our sidewalk infrastructure in 2019, but as you can see, we've made a lot of incremental progress in really developing a network, and we continue to try to connect these networks with each other and have hopefully a recently released trails plan recommends an additional 200 miles of trails to create a seamless network in the region. So the continued incremental progress of the network is really good news, but in 2019, we released our local road safety action plan, and the data that we saw and analyzed through this initiative really drove home the point that building safe, accessible, and walkable communities needs to be a priority in the region. The percent of traffic crashes that involve pedestrians and are fatal are significantly disproportionate to the percent of pedestrian mode share. And the most vulnerable road users are children, people age 65 and older, low-income neighborhoods, and areas that have experienced disinvestment. As you can see from the map, crashes are definitely concentrated in our denser, more urban areas, but they're also all over the region. So it's not just a problem for cities, it is a regional problem. And we know from organizations like the Complete Streets Coalition that people age 65 and older are 50% more likely than younger people to be struck and killed by a car while walking, and traffic crashes are a leading cause of death for children and teens in the United States. So our goal, which we in New Vision state, is to move to zero traffic deaths. And to do this, we must confront the level of death and injury on our roadways as a result of trade-offs. Each decision is literally a matter of life and death. And setting this goal requires a deep and ethical obligation to develop traffic safety solutions that value every life. CDTC's Local Road Safety Action Plan evaluated crash data for 6 years and tailored recommendations and strategies to the CDTC regional context. And CDTC is implementing these recommendations of the plan through our various planning initiatives and tasks, and by working closely with our partners at the New York State Department of Transportation to achieve their pedestrian safety goals that were outlined in the 2016 New York State Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. This plan was New York State's first ever comprehensive pedestrian safety plan. It was a 5-year multi-agency initiative that provided $110 million to improve safety for pedestrians through infrastructure improvements, public education efforts, and enforcement across upstate and Long Island. As you can see, 2 capital region cities, Albany and Schenectady, were identified in the plan as focus communities because of the number of pedestrian crashes. And CDTC and DOT have been working closely with both cities to identify intersections that could be improved through systemic improvements like crosswalks and upgraded pedestrian signals. So CDTC's approach to pedestrian safety and encouraging more pedestrian travel has been the 3 E's, the conventional 3 E's of engineering, education, and enforcement. But we've recently been exploring what have been referred to as the new 3 E's, ethics, equity, and empathy, because these really support the move to zero deaths goal that we have. And these E's replace a rule-centered approach that dominates transportation with a moral one centered on people. And yes, this is obviously difficult for an MPO or any government to measure or develop strategies for, because they're less tangible and more about feelings and perceptions and values, but they're interconnected with the conventional 3 E's, and they're really necessary for us to achieve our goal of 0 traffic deaths. And some of the ways that we have promoted pedestrian safety and encouraged pedestrian travel is through our education and outreach and enforcement efforts. We have provided funding for law enforcement training to train them on vehicle and traffic law and how they can play a role in improving the safety of bicycles and pedestrians. We have provided funds for bike skills training and traffic safety. And in 2016, we introduced our Capital Coexist mini grant program, which provides small amounts of funds for local governments and nonprofits and first responders to do small scale, low budget traffic education and safety programs around the region. We've worked with a number of cities, towns, and entities around the region to do Capital Coexist mini grant projects. Some of them have been demonstration projects, like you can see these green curb extensions in the city of Schenectady to demonstrate safer pedestrian crossings. We've seen Capital Roots work in Cohoes to do crosswalk enforcement, where they partnered with the local police to hand out just education to motorists as they drove through downtown while kids were going to school, to remind them to be cautious and to see kids and people in the crosswalks. And this is a program that we solicit for every year. We recently announced the projects for this year, and we'll do another solicitation at the end of the year. So now I'm going to pass it to Carrie Ward, who will talk about policy and regulations related to accessibility and how CDTC is working with local communities to make streets and intersections accessible for all ages and abilities.
Thanks, Jen. You can go to the next slide. So in particular, I'm going to focus my portion of the presentation on CDTC's work with transition plans for accessible pedestrian infrastructure on the public right-of-way. So just an overview, and I apologize for those of you who use American Community Survey data, because this is 2008 to 2012 5-year average data, which is a little old. But you know, the total number of people who report having a disability in each county is over 18,000. And then the map on the right has 1 dot for every 50 people, again, who report that they have a disability. So it shows, just like the population centers, there's more people in the cities who have disabilities, but people who have disabilities can be found throughout the region, even in rural areas. Next slide. So the Americans with Disabilities Act Title II is what applies to government services. And specifically it says that local governments must ensure that individuals with disabilities are not excluded from programs, services, and activities. And the Barden v. Sacramento did establish that pedestrian facilities are an example of a program. And that that case was back in 2002. So it was about 10 years-ish after the ADA was passed. Next slide. So the basic requirements under Title II for local governments are, again, so the ADA was passed in 1990. So probably most of these, the local governments in our region either certainly had, if not still have, but you're required to designate an ADA coordinator. It's a so it's a person. Develop and post an ADA policy statement, as well as grievance or complaint procedures. I apologize for the colors on these bullets. I don't know why one is black. Complete a self-evaluation of current services, policies, and practices. Again, that probably happened for local governments here for things like your city hall or town hall and your parks, but probably not for your sidewalks. And then develop a transition plan to bring whatever you found in your self-evaluation is not compliant with the ADA up to compliance. And then name the name and position of the person who's going to be responsible for implementing the transition plan. Next slide. So that star there for transition plans on the last slide was to discuss this. If you've looked at the law, you might have noticed that it says something about 50 employees. So the transition plans are actually only required for government entities with greater than 50 employees. And a question that came up a lot when we first started doing this work was, can we not count our police officers? And you do have to count your police officers. So it's combined full and part-time, all employees, and including the police officers. But for fewer than 50 employees, public entities still need to do the self-evaluation. They just don't have to put together the transition plan list of what exactly they're going to fix in which years. And again, Title II is a requirement that provides a tool to address discrimination and access to all programs. Next slide. So when you're putting together the actual transition plan of what you're going to fix when, it is important to identify public involvement opportunities that is actually required. So if you don't do that, it would not look very well if the United States Department of Justice were to investigate you. Develop and adopt design standards, which I'll come back to in a minute. Identify and list the physical obstacles and their location. So, which curb ramp isn't accessible, what piece of sidewalk isn't accessible. Describe in detail the methods that you're going to use to make those facilities accessible. And then provide a schedule for making those access modifications. And I think this is something that is, when we first started doing this work, was scary, really scary for municipalities, because they felt like they were going to have to fix everything in like a short number of years. And it's been made very clear to us from our contacts that we've been working with at Federal Highway Administration that the schedule can certainly be out 30 years. So, it's not a immediate budget suck to fix, especially, if you have a lot of sidewalks, if you have a dense pedestrian network in your municipality. And then provide an annual schedule if the transition plan is over 1 year long, which it probably will be unless you really don't have many sidewalks. Next slide. So I said I was going to come back to the design standards. I think a big part of the reason, even though sidewalks were established as a program in 2002, that they weren't included or amended into transition plans, is that we didn't really know what the definition of an accessible sidewalk was. So we had an accessible pathway inside of a building, and maybe under ADAG addressed from parking lots into buildings, but those are different than the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines, which are written more for public right-of-ways, sidewalks out on the street. So these are applicable to new construction, but also alterations of existing facilities. They are still undergoing the rulemaking process. In 2011, there was an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking published. So that has not been finalized at a federal level. However, NYSDOT has adopted them and incorporated them into the highway design manual. So if you're doing any project with state or federal funds, you definitely, that the standards that they're going to check based on are going to be the PROAC ones. Next slide. Okay, so prioritization is a schedule for making improvements. It needs to, the transition plan needs to include a method for how you're going to prioritize. So you'll have your list of like what you plan to fix in which year, but the document itself needs to explain what that method was, like how you chose which things are going to be at the top of the list. And it's definitely useful to include that or even focus on it in your public input process. I think that's really easier for people to wrap their heads around when they're giving public comments on your work on the transition plan. So this list here is just examples of things that you can use in your prioritization method. So, government centers, transit, public services, libraries, senior centers, things like that are places that everybody needs to get to. You can use some kind of pedestrian level of service, if you're using something like that in your municipality. You can say, if, based on citizen requests, which you could incorporate at the time when you make the transition plan, but you could include some kind of criteria by which the list that you have could change over time, depending on the public input that you're hearing on a continuous basis. Population density or even employment density, presence of the disabled community. If you have I know, like in Albany, there's the Northeast Association for the Blind or an independent living center. You would assume that people who have disabilities are going to go to those places more frequently than other places. And you can include cost, but you definitely should not use cost as the reason why you can't make an improvement. We've been advised that you will lose if you do that. Next slide. Okay. Monitoring progress, I included this here because it's really easy to forget to do this, and it is important to be able to show that you are actually implementing the transition plan. So you can use the transition plan in your annual planning cycle, add to it, over time. So you use your transition plan as your baseline, and then every year, every couple of years, amend to it to show what you have fixed. And also, I'm sorry if you're getting noise. Martin, just let me know if I need to mute.
No, you're fine.
As changes are made to the pedestrian environment, such as street furniture or landscaping, those can cause issues, and they can also kind of change where the pedestrian access route is going to be in the sidewalk realm. Next slide. Okay, so when CDTC first started to work on transition plans with municipalities, we had established a working group, which if you're interested in that, feel free to let me know, although we haven't been meeting in a little while, and I will explain why in a minute. So we had established that working group, and in discussions with the people who were coming to that, it became clear that we really had no idea who was doing what, if anybody was doing anything, and specifically what kind of data existed in the region. So in 2015, and then again in 2018, to do a comparison, we surveyed all of the municipalities in the region to figure out if they had a self-analysis and transition plan, and if they did, which elements of that they had. And we asked what data they had. So like, do you know where your sidewalks are? And do you know where your curb ramps are, sidewalk or crosswalks? Do you have that data? And then also, do you know what the condition of it is? So we learned from that almost all of them did not have a comprehensive data set of sidewalk locations, and never mind everything else that I just said. We didn't find out, we realized that we were kind of very much at a baseline, but it was a useful tool to start conversations within municipalities, I think, to just kind of be a little bit more aware that even though you might have done a transition plan in the 1990s and thought you were finished with that and put it into cold storage somewhere in a paper file in a building far away from City Hall, that we might need to revisit that. Next slide. Okay, so since we realized that we pretty much didn't know where the sidewalks were in the region, we undertook an effort to document the presence and absence of them. So it's basically just to make a map of where the sidewalks were. We did this with staff and with interns in the office. Took us about 3.5 years. I think we finished in 2018 with it. And at that time, I know there's been a few more sidewalk pieces built since then, but at that time, there was 1,225 miles of sidewalks in the region. We did mostly do that online using ortho images, but we did, I think just with an intern, we did do it in person in a few small villages. And we incorporated the data that NYSDOT had already collected for their transition plan because they had just finished one. But I know they had almost 100% used images as well. I believe it was from a photo log that they had in-house. So our data has the route number, if there is one, the road name, the side of the road that the sidewalk is on, the start and end points, the surface type, so brick, concrete, slate, I think were the three, and the length of the segment. And then once we were finished with that, we transmitted the data to the municipalities and with a letter explaining the transition plan requirements. So if you work for a municipality or are affiliated with one and this sounds new to you and you think that nobody there has it anymore or knows that it exists, feel free to let me know and we can retransmit it to somebody. Next slide. And I think Jen had this map up already, but this is the map of the sidewalk locations, and the gray is just the roadways in the region. Next slide. All right, so once we had a map of where the sidewalks were, in early 2020, we hired a consulting firm to work with local municipalities to create transition plans for them. So once we had the consulting firm on board, then last year, in April, we solicited for municipalities to participate, and we just did that again. Solicitation is closed already in April 2021. So the program requires in-kind match. It does not require any cash match, although that is optional. So in-kind, basically time to contribute to the project. The municipality also needs to arrange for the public input opportunities, which can be just, they can be separate meetings, but they can also take place during a meeting that is already scheduled, that is a public meeting, like a town board meeting, and provide us with a list of stakeholders that the municipality is planning on engaging. And we are also requiring a letter of support from the chief elected official, and that's to try and make sure that there is support for the project and that there's a good likelihood that the transition plan will actually be adopted by the municipality. So in 2020, we worked with the town of Glenville and also the city of Saratoga Springs. And just as a kind of status update, Glenville is reviewing their draft transition plan now. And Saratoga Springs is, data collection is finished. And now we are sort of cleaning it and making sure. Well, I know that they're not actually, there's curb ramp dots that are in the middle of intersections. So we need to clean that data and make sure all the dots are in the correct locations, move them to wherever they're actually supposed to be. And then we'll be drafting the transition plan for them. Next slide. Okay, so the municipal process, once we have a city, town, or village on board, we're confirming the non-data collection components. So the biggest hurdle is collecting all of the data, but we're making sure that the policy language and the grievance and complaint procedure that you probably already had, that you can find it and that you're still good with it. And then the municipality needs to do the stakeholder meetings, which again can be the stakeholder meetings can be we can think of it as an advisory kind of a group or not, or just think of them as stakeholder meetings. And inviting groups that are focused on seniors, so senior centers, and people who have disabilities is important. We are doing technical training for whoever it is who is going to be collecting the data. It's helpful. The firm that we're working with has been able to find some interns to do some of the data collection, but it is helpful to have somebody from the municipality do some of it. And I would say I would very, very strongly suggest that at least somebody at the municipality knows what's happening, so that in the future they can understand the data that they're looking at and can add to it as necessary. And then here we go. Public meetings can be a separate public meeting or as an agenda item at an existing meeting. The form at the right here is one of two that we developed for this project to collect the data in the field. So like I said, we have the locations of sidewalks and we're also collecting data on bus stops, but we have the locations of the bus stops. So one of the forms, this one here, is to collect both the location of the elements, so curb ramps and crosswalks if we don't already have location for, as well as the condition information on those items. Next slide. Data collection, hardware and software. So for this project, we have been using ArcGIS online. So we need somebody, whoever's collecting data, needs to have a device with internet data plan and GPS. So that can be a cell phone, but a tablet is a little bit easier to click on the buttons when you're out in the field because it's bigger. ArcGIS online credentials, which has worked really well, setting those up through the consulting firm with like user, a separate user for the local staff to do data collection. And then the two apps, which are free apps, kind of as an add-on once you have ArcGIS online, is ArcGIS Collector and Survey 123. And then this map here is from our work in Glenville, and it's showing the sidewalks and trails, so the linear pieces, and the condition of them after the condition data was collected. Next slide. All right, so this is just a summary slide of the data collection points that we are using. So we are collecting the condition data based on the ProWag, but we're doing it in a simplified manner. So essentially what we're collecting in the field is a simple 1 to 4 rating for the sidewalks, which is following what NYSDOT had done and what the Federal Highway Administration has advised is acceptable, even though it is really simple. And then for curb ramps, we're collecting the detectable warning dimensions and contrast, visual contrast. And for pedestrian signals, the type of the signal, whether it's visual, audible, or both, and some access measurements to the button location. For transit stops, the access dimensions, and for crosswalks, the surface requirements, so the smooth, stable, and slip resistant crosswalk surface. Next slide.
Hey, Carrie, not to go back too far, but we did have a question, and I apologize I missed it in the chat. We had a question about the ADA Transition Plan Assistance. Is that program going to be available again in 2022 by chance?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
We had planned for budget for 2 years, and this is our 2nd year for that. So I think, the short answer is I don't know. If we can see that there's a lot of interest remaining, then it's more likely that we would decide to program additional funding for it. Last year we only had 2 applications, and this year we had 2 applications as well, which we're pretty sure we're going to be able to do both of them this year. So we haven't been bombarded with applications each year.
So I'm sure you'll have our contact information at the end of that presentation. So if the person with the question wanted to contact you and inquire about the history of that program, or maybe there are some other opportunities to do that kind of work, I would recommend they reach out to CDTC directly, and you may be able to make something work out for them.
Yeah. Thanks.
I saw Carrie's email post in the chat, so hopefully that provides.
Yeah, I think it is actually not in the presentation, so you should pull it out of the chat.
Okay.
And then this slide is just an overview. I've actually just put this in here to show that there's when this is Saratoga Springs, and when you do have a lot of like a thick sidewalk network, you do have a high density of information that you're looking at. Next slide. And then it looks like Rob Leslie is still here. So I'm pretty sure this is Bethlehem. We didn't work with Bethlehem's, but this the image is very similar to what we're doing, where once you have all your data collected, it's really easy to click on a point and see what information you had collected about it, and to include the image that you can take out in the field. And next slide. Okay, this is my last slide, although it's not Jen's last slide. I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of this. NYSDOT issued an engineering bulletin, some sort of the second half-ish of 2020. It's engineering bulletin 20-053. That's the name of it there, and it's relevant to this conversation because in it says that a sponsor's, so the local municipalities, ADA transition plan shall include a list of locations, blah, 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 including those identified alongside state highways. So that's a little bit different than what we had been anticipating and what we had been saying until the engineering bulletin came out. But they clearly are saying that the state at least expects local municipalities to include the sidewalks along state roadways in their transition plans. And I'm all set, Jen.
All right, so just a few more slides to wrap this up. Going forward with creating a walkable and accessible community, kind of going off of what Carrie was talking about, but not listed on the slide is, CDTC, our goal is obviously to expand walking and bicycling access to as many people as possible in the region, but we also promote a fix it first, preservation first, policy so that we continue to maintain the system that we have and that the sidewalk network that exists remains in good condition so that it can continue to be accessed safely. You know, going forward as we do all transportation planning, but definitely pedestrian planning, challenges that we see on the horizon and are kind of uncertain as far as, you know, the strategy to implement right now, connected and automated vehicles. We see more and more connected vehicle technology being deployed, and we are unsure of what the timeline or if automated vehicles will happen, but it is something that is definitely on our radar and something that we want to make sure that if they are deployed, that pedestrian and non-vehicle safety continues to be a priority, and that these vehicles can coexist with other modes. Also, new electric mobility like electric assist bikes or electric scooters. You know, all of these devices are really important for shifting more trips away from vehicles and to expand mobility options and choices, but they can conflict with each other. And these are things that we are monitoring and learning from other areas of the country that have already deployed these devices and have seen conflicts and then have reacted to them with some effective policies and design. So we are, you know, CDTA's CDPHP cycle is adding electric scooters this season. So we'll see how this works out. And other rapidly evolving technology applications that allow people to hail rides or to get other real-time travel information are really changing the way that people are behaving, both in their vehicles and, you know, what and how people are choosing modes or how people are choosing to get from place to place. So, you know, this is something that we're also monitoring and trying to learn more about and hoping to, again, continue to prioritize people over vehicles despite any technological advances. And then, of course, the long-term impacts of COVID. Are there going to be impacts to land use because of a shift to work from home, or are there going to be long-term traffic impacts that, you know, that will affect how we do transportation planning? Transportation planning really revolves around that AM and PM peak hour travel, but if we can plan for different kinds of trips throughout the day, there is more opportunity to build and to create more walkable, more complete streets, because, you know, a lot of those other trips are less than 5 miles, or a lot of them are even less than 3, and they're very feasible to be done outside of a vehicle. So what kind of assistance and resources can CDTC provide? We have a Complete Streets program. We have been doing workshops with communities that apply depending upon what phase they're in the Complete Streets ordinance implementation timeline, whether they're just interested in developing an ordinance or they have an ordinance and they want help implementing it. CDTC has been working with them to have workshops and to really tailor recommendations and strategies for that community. Our transportation and community linkage program, this is an annual solicitation we do, and we actually recently, we're just kicking off this year's projects now, but we'll do another solicitation next year. The technical assistance program is something we've partnered with CDRPC on. This is a smaller scale funding assistance program, but it can be used for data collection, data analysis and mapping, safety and operations planning, general community planning, and even recreational trail planning. And there is an open solicitation for proposals right now for that. You need to contact CDTC or CDRPC with your proposal first. Then data and information that we provide to communities or can help collect or analyze for communities. We have a number of GIS resources. We've mentioned multiple times the sidewalk inventory. We're also developing a bicycle infrastructure inventory and our trail database and mapping applications. We regularly conduct and can conduct by request bicycle, pedestrian, and trail counts. We are in the process of purchasing automated counters that we hope to install on a few different trails in the region and rotate them on an annual basis to get a good measure of use there throughout the year. We have survey templates and data that we've collected through surveys over the last several years. And of course, safety data and mapping. Everyone is really interested in funding, right? So we also do have funding resources for communities. We mentioned the Capital Coexist mini grant program. This is an annual solicitation. We make $25,000 available every year, and these are small grants or up to $5,000, but they have been pretty effective in doing some testing out road designs, but also educating people on traffic safety. The Transportation Improvement Program, this is the 5-year capital plan, and we do expect to do a tip solicitation later this year. We are anticipating, I don't know if anyone has maybe heard from about these two programs, but hopefully soon DOT will announce the Transportation Alternatives Program and Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program solicitation, and the Recreational Trails Program, which is administered by the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Some other resources that might be helpful, CDTC has put out, I guess, a white paper on the bicycle level of service analysis, how to measure bike friendliness of Capital District roadways. It kind of explains why we've adopted the level of traffic stress, and it's definitely geared towards bicycles, but the different criteria for assessing the level of traffic stress can also be used to, can somewhat be used to assess friendliness or stress for pedestrians. The Bicycle and Pedestrian Action Plan, that's part of New Visions 2050, outlines the goals and actions and strategies that are part of New Visions. The Bicycle and Pedestrian Prioritization Tool, our Capital Coexist campaign materials and giveaways. We have a link on our webpage to Capital Coexist. We have workbooks and other giveaways and technical assistance for communities. Trail mapping, the Capital District Trails Plan was released in 2019. The Trails Perspective is and the Count Report is a survey of people's opinions and attitudes and types of use of our trails and how many people are using trails and where they're coming from. And our Regional Sidewalk Inventory Report and our Walk and Roll to School Toolkit, that should be a separate bullet. And right now, we are in the implementation phase of New Visions. And as part of that, we have initiated a virtual learning series. Oops, sorry about that. We've initiated, I don't know what is going on with my screen right now. Okay. We initiated a virtual learning series that we have on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. We have a webinar that focuses on a different topic in New Visions. On the CDTC webpage under news and events, you can go right to the learning series page and see information about upcoming webinars or training opportunities. We are accepting requests for zoning board, town council, town board, city council training on New Visions, and we are posting all of our webinars. They're all recorded and they're posted to our YouTube channel. Okay, it does not want to let me go, but okay, past that slide. So that's all we have for today. Everything that we talked about can be found on our website, cdtcmpo.org. I did put Carrie and our email addresses in the chat, but We can also be reached at newvisions@cdtcmpo.org. We are on social media. So yeah, you can connect with us afterwards if you have any questions.
This is a really fantastic presentation. You had a scorched earth approach, covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. So I really appreciate you both of you for sharing all this information with us. I encourage people to reach out to CDTC and engage with them about the various funding opportunities, the different types of programs that you sponsor, and the ways that communities can really drive the transportation investment decisions that are made on a regional scale. I think that's one thing that really needs to be emphasized is communities have a role to play in transportation policy in the region, and you guys are helping to broker that decision-making process. So I do want to thank you so much for providing your expertise and content with us today. Very fascinating material. I do have to give a shameless plug for next week's session. We'll be back next Wednesday, 1 p.m. That session will be Planning Infrastructure for Natural Resiliency and Green Solutions, and that'll be brought to you by presenting sponsor LaBerge Group. And if you haven't signed up for that event, please remember to do so through our Eventbrite page. Those of you who joined us will get an automatic email exactly 24 hours after this event concludes. So keep an eye out for your email in your email box. And if you don't get it, certainly reach out to us at CDRPC and we can look to furnish you with confirmation of attendance. So thank you again to Jen and Carrie. Really appreciate your time today. And I look forward to seeing everybody next week.